I hope he was worth it, I said, my voice flat. My fingers curled around the whiskey glass, the ice inside barely melting. Jasmine stood by the kitchen counter, arms crossed, back straight. Always composed, always in control, except now she wasn't. She didn't answer right away. That was her mistake. Silence was an admission. I let the moment stretch, watching her, studying her like I would fresh tracks in the snow. She shifted her weight, exhaled through her nose. Elliot. I held up a hand. Spare me. I took a slow sip, let the burn settle in my throat. How long? Her lips pressed together, her gaze flicking to the floor for just a second. Another mistake. Guilt shows in the smallest movements. Not long. She forced herself to look at me. It didn't mean it. Don't, I cut in. Don't tell me it didn't mean anything. You don't throw away 15 years for nothing. She swallowed hard, but that was all the reaction I got. No tears. No breakdown. Jasmine was practical, logical. That was why it happened in the first place. Convenience. Opportunity. Those mattered more to her than vows. I set the glass down. The house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the distant creak of Bowie shifting in his corner. He could feel it too, something in the air had broken. Louis Yates, I said, watching her closely. The chef. A flicker in her eyes, barely a second, but I caught it. He was hired for the Iversons' anniversary party. You liked his food. You liked the attention. I leaned back in my chair. That about cover it? She clenched her jaw. It wasn't just that. I gave a humorless chuckle. Yell? Then tell me. What was it? A beat of silence. Then finally, I was lonely. I let out a breath, ran a hand through my beard. You could have talked to me. She shook her head. You were never here. That part stung. Not because it was entirely true, but because it was the easy excuse. I worked hard. Guided people through the mountains, taught survival, spent time mentoring kids who didn't have fathers to teach them. I came home bone-tired but steady, thinking I was building a life we both wanted. And while I was out tracking trails and reading the land, another man was reading my wife. I stood up, chair scraping against the hardwood. Bowie lifted his head, ears perked. Jasmine straightened like she expected me to explode. I didn't. I wasn't built that way. You want me to yell? I asked. Throw something? Cry. I shook my head. Not happening. But I'll tell you what is happening, I'm leaving. Her brows pulled together. Elliot. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I walked to the bedroom, grabbed a duffel bag from the closet. Threw in a couple of flannels, jeans, socks. Essentials. The cabin up at Black Bear Ridge had everything else I needed. Jasmine stood in the doorway, arms still crossed but her expression cracking. You're just going to go? I zipped the bag, turned to face her. What else is there to say? She opened her mouth, then shut it. I slung the bag over my shoulder, whistled for Bowie. He trotted to my side, his claws clicking against the wood floor. At the front door, I hesitated just long enough to look back. You made your choice, I said. Now I'm making mine. Then I stepped out into the cold, and for the first time in a long time, I breathed easy. The drive up to Black Bear Ridge was quiet. No radio, no distractions. Just the hum of the truck's engine and the steady breathing of Bowie in the passenger seat. The snow had started falling again, light and steady, dusting the pines on either side of the road. I rolled down the window, letting the cold air in, letting it clear my head. I wasn't angry. Anger was a waste of energy. It clouded judgment, led men to make mistakes. No, this was something else. Something colder. A shift. One moment, you're standing on solid ground. The next, the ice cracks beneath your feet and you realize the foundation was never as strong as you thought. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sky had turned a deep blue, the last light fading over the mountains. The place was simple, just one room, a wood stove, and a cot in the corner. No distractions, no noise. Exactly what I needed. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching against the packed snow. Bowie jumped down after me, sniffing the air before trotting off to Louis's territory. I grabbed some wood from the pile, got the fire going, then sank into the chair near the stove, letting the heat work its way into my bones. I took out my phone. No messages. Not that I expected any. Jasmine wouldn't reach out, not yet. She was stubborn like that, needed time to justify things to herself, to spin the story in a way that made sense. Didn't matter. I wasn't waiting. The next morning, I drove back into town early, stopping by Paige's general store for supplies. The bell over the door jingled as I stepped inside. Paige looked up from behind the counter, dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, sleeves rolled up. Well, if it isn't the mountain man himself. Didn't think I'd see you for another week? I grabbed a bag of coffee beans off the shelf. Plans changed. She leaned on the counter, eyes narrowing slightly. This have anything to do with the fact that Jasmine came in yesterday looking like she swallowed a lemon? I glanced up. That right? She nodded. Didn't buy anything, just stood near the shelves like she wanted to be seen. Seemed off. I tossed a tin of chewing tobacco onto the counter. I bet. Paige exhaled, tapping her nails against the wood. You want to talk about it? I pulled out my wallet. Not particularly. She studied me for a moment, then shrugged. Fair enough. She rang me up, her expression unreadable. But just so you know, if you're planning some kind of slow burn revenge, I'd like to be on the betting pool. I let out a small chuckle. Noted. I left with my supplies, took a walk through town, just observing. Silver Creek wasn't big. Word traveled fast. A few people gave me nods, some looks lingered a little too long. They knew. Maybe not the details, but enough to guess. By midday, I ended up at Father Caleb's church. Not because I needed guidance, but because I knew he'd have an opinion whether I wanted to hear it or not. The place was empty except for him, sitting in one of the back pews, thumbing through a worn Bible. He looked up as I approached. Elliot. I sat down next to him, leaned forward, elbows on my knees. Got a minute? For you? Always. He shut the book, resting it on his lap. Though if I had to guess, I'd say this isn't a social call. I exhaled, staring at the wooden floorboards. Jasmine cheated. Caleb didn't react right away. Just sat there, fingers laced together, watching me. Finally, he said, You want my honest opinion? That's why I'm here? He let out a breath. Then I'll tell you this, grief takes many forms. Anger, sadness, numbness. Some men drink themselves into a hole. Others pretend nothing happened and go on like everything's fine. And what do smart men do? They take their time. He turned slightly to face me. You don't need to make any decisions today, Elliot. Or tomorrow. Let yourself sit with it. The right answer comes when you stop looking for it. I nodded slowly. Appreciate the wisdom. He smirked. It's not wisdom, it's experience. You wouldn't be the first man who walked in here with the same problem. I stood up. And how did those stories usually end? His smirk faded. Depends on the man. I left the church with his words rattling around in my head, but deep down, I already knew. I wasn't the type to drink myself into a hole or pretend it never happened. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for the right answer to come to me. Jasmine had made her choice. Now I'd make mine. And I'd make damn sure she felt every inch of the distance I was putting between us. A week passed. Then another. I stayed up at the cabin, kept busy with guiding trips, and let the town do what it did best, talk. Jasmine hadn't called. I hadn't expected her to. She wasn't the type to beg or make a scene. But I knew she was feeling it. The silence. The shift. When a man stops reacting, stops giving a woman anything to push against, she starts to feel it in ways she never expected. I saw it in small things. Ran into Tom Iverson outside the hardware store and he gave me that knowing nod. Heard about Jasmine. I adjusted the bag of dog food over my shoulder. That right? Tom shrugged. Women talk. My wife says she's been different. Looking. I don't know. Unsettled. I didn't answer. Just let the words sit between us. Tom scratched his chin. You doing okay? I gave him a half smile. I ever not okay? That was enough for him. He chuckled, clapped me on the shoulder, and we went our separate ways. That night, I took Bowie out to Henson Creek, let him run while I sat on the tailgate of my truck, staring out at the water. I wasn't angry, wasn't bitter. If anything, I felt lighter. Like I'd cut loose something that had been weighing me down for a long time. I thought about what Caleb had said about how men handle things differently. He was right. Some men drink. Some beg. Some try to make sense of things that don't deserve understanding. Me? I moved forward. Jasmine had her affair for attention. For validation. So I made sure she got none of it from me. When I went into town, I didn't avoid her, but I didn't acknowledge her either. If she was in the general store, I'd nod at Paige, buy my things, and leave without a glance in her direction. If I saw her in passing, I didn't tense, didn't change course, just kept going like she wasn't there. And that, more than anything, started to get to her. One afternoon, I was having coffee at the Rusted Elk, the only decent diner in town, when she walked in. I saw her hesitate, saw the flicker of something cross her face when she spotted me. But I just kept stirring my coffee, eyes on the paper in front of me. She took a seat at the counter. Ordered a black coffee, no sugar. I could feel her watching me, waiting for something. Paige caught it too. She poured Jasmine's coffee, set the cup down a little harder than necessary. Anything else? Jasmine shook her head. Paige glanced at me, smirked, then walked off to the kitchen. It wasn't long before Jasmine got up, coffee barely touched. As she passed by my booth, she slowed. Elliot. I turned the page of my newspaper. Jasmine. A pause. Like she was waiting for something else. Finally, she sighed. That's it? I looked up then, meeting her gaze for the first time in weeks. What else is there? Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. Just nodded once and walked out. I watched her go, then folded the paper and tossed a few bills onto the table. Paige walked back over, grabbed my empty cup. You know, she said, wiping down the table, I think that woman's realizing she miscalculated. I stood, grabbing my coat. Maybe. Paige arched a brow. You enjoying this? I pulled on my jacket, adjusted my hat. Not enjoying. Just observing. And that was the truth. Jasmine wasn't expecting this. She had expected anger, arguments, some kind of emotional outburst she could push against. Instead, she got nothing. No reaction. No fight. And that was the one thing she didn't know how to handle. Word spread fast in Silver Creek, but it wasn't just about Jasmine and Lewis anymore. People started putting pieces together, and once they did, the picture wasn't flattering. Lewis Yates, the charming personal chef who'd been so eager to make connections, had a history. Women started talking, widowed ranchers, bored housewives, even a young waitress from the Rusted Elk, all had stories about how he'd pushed boundaries, how he knew just the right words to make a woman feel special. Until she wasn't. Until someone else was. Jasmine wasn't just another affair. She was one of many. It wasn't long before her father, Marcus Roberts, got wind of it. Marcus was an old-school rancher, a man who believed in hard work, loyalty, and the weight of a name. He was also a man who didn't tolerate being made a fool. I was stacking firewood behind Paige's store when he pulled up in his truck. Engine off, door slammed, boots crunching on gravel. He didn't bother with a greeting. That bastard was in my house. I set the axe down, wiped my hands on my jeans. That's so? Marcus's face was red, his jaw tight. Sat at my table. Ate my food. Looked me in the damn eye. He shook his head. And all the while, he didn't finish. Just let the words hang there. I leaned against the woodpile, crossed my arms. What are you looking to do about it? Marcus exhaled sharply, paced a few steps. If I were 20 years younger, I'd knock his teeth in. He kicked at the dirt, then looked at me. You knew. I nodded. Yeah. You let me find out on my own. Not my place to tell you. He studied me, then gave a short nod, like he respected that answer even if he didn't like it. You know, I raised her better than this. I didn't say anything. Wasn't my job to make him feel better about his daughter's choices. Marcus clenched his jaw, then muttered, if she thinks she's getting another dime from me, she's got another thing coming. And that was that. By the time Marcus left, it was clear Jasmine's safety net was gone. The bank account her father had helped fund? Closed. The family connections she'd always leaned on? Fading. The friends who used to admire her polished, put-together life? Now they just whispered behind her back. And Lewis? He was already slipping out of town, moving on to the next opportunity, leaving her behind to deal with the mess. The next time I saw Jasmine, it was outside the grocery store. She was standing by her car, staring down at her phone like it held all the answers. When she looked up and saw me, she hesitated, then squared her shoulders and walked over. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, shifting her weight like she wasn't sure how to stand in front of me anymore. You've made your point. I frowned. Didn't realize I was making one. She huffed a breath. You didn't have to orchestrate all this. I let out a short laugh. I didn't orchestrate a damn thing, Jasmine. You did this. You picked him. You let him in. You just didn't bother to find out what kind of man he really was. She swallowed, her face tightening. And you? What, you're just innocent in all this? Innocent? No. But I kept my vows. I stepped closer, just enough that she had to tilt her chin to hold my gaze. You made your choice. Now you get to live with it. She blinked fast, looked away. I didn't think it would end up like this. Most bad decisions don't. She inhaled sharply, as if she had more to say, but then just exhaled and turned away. As she walked back to her car, I watched her for a moment, then shook my head and walked into the store. I wasn't interested in explanations. Or regrets. She was looking back, trying to hold onto something that wasn't there anymore. Me? I was already too far ahead. Winter settled in hard. The kind of cold that cut through layers, that made every breath sharp. The mountains were quieter, the roads slower. Most folks in Silver Creek hunkered down this time of year, but I liked it. Less noise. Less people. Just the land, the dog, and the work. Jasmine had disappeared from town for a while. Took time off work, didn't show up at the places she used to. I heard she was staying in a rental on the outskirts, barely seeing anyone except for trips into town. Paige told me she'd been in the store once, looking thinner, tired. Didn't say much, she'd added. Just bought coffee and left. Didn't matter to me. Wasn't my concern. At least, that's what I told myself. Then Sheriff Dan Harris knocked on my cabin door one morning, hands shoved in his coat pockets, breath coming out in thick clouds. Got a minute? I stepped aside, let him in. Bowie sniffed him once, then wandered back to his spot by the stove. Dan pulled off his gloves, rubbed his hands together. "This about Jasmine?" I asked. He gave me a look like he wasn't surprised I'd figured that out already. Not directly. I waited. Dan exhaled, took a seat at the table. "You ever hear anything about Yates before all this?" I sat across from him. "Not much. Just that he liked the attention." Dan nodded slowly. "Well, turns out that's not all he liked." He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Got a call from a buddy of mine over in Billings. Says Yates' name's been coming up in some ugly conversations. Money changing hands, young girls involved. The kind of thing that gets people locked up for a long time." I let that settle. "You saying he's into trafficking?" Dan's expression didn't change. "I'm saying he's connected to the kind of people who are. And he's got a habit of getting real close to married women with money, then slipping away before things go south." He tapped a finger against the wood. "Sound familiar?" I thought about Jasmine. About how easily she'd fallen for him. About how she'd never bothered to look too deep. I felt something shift inside me, something colder than anger. "You need something from me?" I asked. Dan shook his head. "Just thought you should know. Guy's got a record, but nothing solid enough to stick. Yet, my buddy's keeping an eye on him." He hesitated, then added, "And Jasmine." I raised a brow. She was another Lewis Elliot. Whatever she thought this was, it was never about her. It was about what he could get. I nodded once. Figured as much. Dan stood, pulling his gloves back on. "If you hear anything, let me know." I walked him to the door, watched as he climbed into his cruiser and drove off down the snowy road. Then I stood there for a long time, watching the pines sway in the wind, the sky gray and heavy. That night, I sat by the fire, Bowie curled at my feet, thinking about the way Jasmine had looked in the grocery store parking lot. The way she'd hesitated like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I should have walked away from it. I owed her nothing. But when I closed my eyes, all I could see was the way she'd looked at me back when things were good, before the affair, before the lies. And I knew I had one last thing to do. I found her where I figured she'd be, at the rental on the outskirts of town. It was a small place, nothing like the house we used to share. A single porch light flickered weakly against the wind, snow piled high against the edges of the driveway. Her car was parked out front, half covered in frost, like she hadn't driven it much. I knocked once. Waited. The door cracked open, just enough for her to see who it was. When she did, her shoulders tensed. "Elliot." I could smell stale coffee, maybe whiskey, coming from inside. She looked like hella hollowed out, pale. Her hair wasn't done, and her sweater hung off her like she'd lost weight. I held up a thermos. "Figured you could use a decent cup of coffee." She blinked at it, then at me. "You bring peace offerings now?" I shrugged. "Just a cup of coffee." She hesitated, then stepped aside. I walked in, letting the door shut behind me. The place was sparse, barely lived in. A couch, a couple of boxes, a stack of unpaid bills on the counter. She motioned vaguely toward the kitchen table. "You can sit. Or don't. Up to you." I set the thermos down, pulled out a chair. Bowie sat by the door, watching. Jasmine poured herself a cup, wrapped both hands around it like she was holding onto something solid for the first time in weeks. She took a sip, exhaled. "Why are you here?" I leaned back. Dan came by. Her grip tightened slightly. I watched her reaction. "Told me Yates has a history." "That history?" She looked away. "I don't want to talk about him." "Tough." I folded my arms. "You ever wonder why he left so fast? Or why you haven't heard from him?" Her jaw clenched. "He didn't just use you, Jasmine. He uses women like you. Finds them, gets what he needs, then moves on." I let that settle before adding, "And this time, it's worse than you think." She stared into her cup, not speaking. "Did he ever ask you for money?" Her breath hitched slightly. "That's what I thought." She rubbed her temple, her voice tight. "He said he needed help getting back on his feet. That his business was struggling." She let out a bitter laugh. "I was an idiot. I didn't argue." She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the cup. "He took 10 grand. I exhaled slowly. She shook her head, her eyes wet but hard. "I don't even care about the money. She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. I didn't say anything. Just watched as she pulled herself together. Finally, she looked at me. "So what do I do?" "That depends." I leaned forward. "Are you done lying to yourself?" She inhaled sharply, but she didn't argue. Didn't deflect. For the first time in weeks, I saw something break in her, something that had been holding on by sheer force of will. She looked down, nodded once. I pulled out a folded piece of paper, slid it across the table. "That's Dan's number. You call him. You tell him everything you know. He's got people looking for Yates." If they find him, maybe they can stop him before he does this to someone else. She stared at the number like it held more weight than she could carry. Then she reached out and took it. I stood, grabbing my coat. She looked up at me, something unreadable in her expression. Elliot. I met her eyes. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I nodded. Yeah. I opened the door, let the cold rush in. Take care, Jasmine. Then I walked out, knowing I'd just closed that chapter for good. Snow crunched under my boots as I stepped out onto the ridge. The air was sharp, clean, the kind that made a man feel wide awake just standing in it. Below, the valley stretched out in every direction, untouched and quiet. No people. No noise. Just the land the way it had always been. Bowie trotted ahead, sniffing at the ground, then looking back at me like he was waiting for something. I gave him a short nod and he took off, cutting through the powder like he owned the place. I stood there a moment longer, taking it all in, then reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. No missed calls. No messages. Jasmine had done what I told her to do. She called Dan, gave him everything she knew. It wasn't much, but it was enough to put Yates on a radar he didn't want to be on. Dan had connections, and once the right people started looking, men like Yates didn't get far. Last I heard, he'd skipped state. But men like him always thought they were smarter than they were. Eventually, they slipped up. And when they did, someone would be waiting. As for Jasmine, she was still in town, but barely. Word was she was leaving soon, heading east. Somewhere no one knew her, no one whispered about her in the aisles of the grocery store. I had no reason to stop her. No reason to care. She'd made her choice, and now she had to live with it. Just like I had. The house was mine now, legally and completely. Papers signed, everything settled. I hadn't decided what to do with it yet. Maybe I'd sell it. Maybe I'd just let it sit there, an empty reminder of what used to be. Either way, it didn't matter much. I wasn't in a rush to figure it out. I'd been spending more time with Paige, though I wasn't sure what to call it yet. She never pushed, never asked for more than I was willing to give. Just made sure I had fresh coffee when I stopped by, made a place for me at the bar when the store got quiet. It was easy. No expectations. Just two people who understood how the world worked. Up here, though, on the ridge, none of that mattered. It was just me, the cold, and the weight that had finally lifted. I crouched, ran a hand through Bowie's fur, staring out at the land that had always been there, steady and unchanged. My old man once told me that a man's worth wasn't in what he lost, but in what he could walk away from without looking back. I took one last deep breath, let it settle in my chest, then stood up. Time to move forward.